This wasn't announced with sirens. There was no emergency alert buzzing on your phone, no press conference with flashing lights, no urgent banner screaming across the screen, nothing that told you to stop what you were doing. Instead, it appeared quietly, buried deep inside scientific briefings most people never read, hidden between footnotes, data tables, and technical language meant for other experts. Internal memos, updates, revisions, the kind of information that doesn't go viral, the kind that waits. But now scientists are saying something that should make anyone pause. Earth's pressure zones are shifting, and they're moving faster than expected. Not in a distant future, not as a theory for the next century, not as a slow, gradual change our grandchildren might deal with. Now. And that's what makes this warning unsettling. There's no panic in their voices, no dramatic language, no emotional appeal. Just numbers quietly changing position on global maps. Lines moving where they've stayed for generations. Patterns no longer lining up with what we built our world around. One scientist described it simply, the system isn't failing, it's relocating. That sentence doesn't sound dangerous, but it should. Because when Earth's pressure zones move, weather doesn't just change, expectations break. The seasons people rely on don't arrive the same way. Storms don't follow familiar paths. Rain falls where it didn't before, and disappears where it always did. And most people won't notice it immediately. That's the most unsettling part. By the time it feels obvious, by the time it feels personal, the shift has already happened. This isn't a loud warning, it's a quiet one. And history shows us something uncomfortable. The calmest warnings are often the ones we regret ignoring the most. Let's slow this down, because this part matters more than most people realize. Earth isn't balanced by luck. It isn't held together by coincidence. What feels normal to us is actually the result of invisible systems working in quiet coordination every single day. One of the most important of those systems is pressure. Pressure zones are massive regions in Earth's atmosphere where air is constantly moving, either rising or sinking. You can't see them, you can't feel them directly, but everything around you responds to them. When air sinks, it creates high pressure zones. These bring calm skies, dry conditions, and stability. They're the reason some regions are predictable, farmable, livable. When air rises, it forms low pressure zones. These generate clouds, storms, rainfall, and sometimes chaos. They are necessary, but powerful. Now here's the part most people don't think about. These zones don't just decide tomorrow's weather. They quietly decide where civilization is possible. For thousands of years, human settlement followed pressure patterns without knowing their names. Cities grew where rain arrived on time. Farming thrived where seasons behaved consistently. Trade routes formed where storms were rare, not constant. Entire cultures rose because pressure zones stayed predictable, and that predictability became assumption. Generation after generation built homes, roads, food systems, and economies under the belief that these invisible systems would stay roughly where they always had. And for a very long time, they did. Scientists mapped these zones, modeled them, trusted them. They moved slightly with seasons, shifted a little with natural cycles, but overall, they stayed within expected boundaries until recently. That's when researchers began noticing something subtle. The zones weren't just fluctuating, they were drifting, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, in the same direction, over multiple years across different datasets. That's when concern replaced curiosity. Because when a system that has guided human life for thousands of years starts behaving differently, it's not just a scientific detail, it's a foundational change, and foundations don't announce when they start to move, they just do. Here's the part scientists didn't expect. For decades, climate models assumed change would be gradual, slow enough to track, slow enough to adjust for, slow enough to explain. That assumption is now breaking, because the pressure zones aren't drifting slowly anymore. They're jumping, not in a way you'd notice from one week to the next, but in a way that becomes undeniable when years of data are placed side by side. Satellite observations, the most reliable tools scientists have, are showing pressure belts sliding toward the poles at a pace no one planned for. Not a few years ahead of schedule, decades. Older climate models predicted subtle shifts over long timelines. What the satellites are recording looks very different. The movement is sharper, more persistent, and happening across multiple regions at once. That changes everything, because pressure zones act like invisible highways for weather. When they move, storms don't follow the old routes. Hurricanes begin to curve differently. Jet streams wobble instead of flowing smoothly. Storm systems linger where they used to pass quickly. Rainfall patterns start breaking apart. Some regions receive heavy rain all at once, overwhelming systems built for gradual seasons. Other regions slowly dry out, not through dramatic droughts, but through mist rains that never arrive. And the most confusing part? It doesn't look consistent. One year feels normal, the next feels off, then extreme, then strangely calm again. That inconsistency isn't randomness. It's what happens when long-standing atmospheric systems lose their anchors. Seasons too begin to lose their reliability. Spring arrives earlier but doesn't behave like spring. Summer stretches longer, then interrupts itself. Winter shows up late, leaves early, or returns unexpectedly. People sense this before they understand it. They say things like, "Something feels different." The weather doesn't act right anymore. They're not wrong. And this isn't speculation, it isn't opinion, it isn't a warning built on fear. This is measured data, collected from satellites, cross-checked across institutions, compared against decades of historical records. The numbers line up. The trend is clear. Earth's pressure zones are shifting faster than expected, and the systems built around their old positions are now trying to catch up. Quietly, urgently, in real time. You might ask something completely reasonable. If this is serious, why isn't everyone talking about it? Why isn't it on every screen? Why aren't leaders addressing it directly? Why does it feel like scientists are lowering their voices instead of raising alarms? The answer is uncomfortable, because panic doesn't help systems respond. Scientists learned this the hard way during past climate alarms. When warnings went public before plans were ready, fear moved faster than solutions. Markets reacted before infrastructure. Politics moved before preparation. Trust eroded before understanding formed. And in many cases, systems collapsed not because the danger was immediate, but because the reaction was uncontrolled. That lesson changed how warnings are delivered. Today, the most serious concerns don't arrive with dramatic language. They arrive wrapped in caution, carefully worded reports, neutral phrasing, emotion deliberately removed. Not because the situation is small, but because it's large. Urgency is hidden between the lines, visible only to those trained to read it. When scientists say, results suggest a statistically significant shift, what they mean is, this is happening, and it's not noise. When they write, models may require reassessment. What they're really saying is, our assumptions no longer hold. And when one researcher quietly described the situation like this, the system isn't broken, but it's no longer where we built everything to survive. That sentence matters more than it sounds. Because broken systems can be fixed. Relocated systems require adaptation, fast. Nothing failed suddenly. No switch flipped. No disaster announced itself. Instead, the foundation moved while attention was elsewhere. Cities, farms, water systems, and economies were designed around stable patterns. Those patterns didn't shatter, they shifted, and shifts are harder to respond to than emergencies. Emergencies demand action. Shifts demand foresight. That's why the warnings are quiet. Not because there's nothing to worry about, but because there's too much at stake to get the response wrong. The goal isn't to frighten the public, it's to buy time, time to adapt. Time to adjust systems, time to catch up to a planet that has already started moving on, and the people closest to the data understand something deeply unsettling. By the time a warning becomes loud, the opportunity to prepare is often already gone. This isn't abstract. This isn't something happening only on charts or inside computer models. Shifting pressure zones reach directly into everyday life, often in ways people don't immediately connect. Take farming regions. Areas that relied on predictable rainfall for generations are now missing key weeks of moisture. Not dramatic droughts at first, just soil that stays dry a little longer than it should. Seeds fail quietly, yields drop slightly, then consistently. Farmers don't panic. They adapt until adaptation stops working. Cities feel it differently. Urban areas built for occasional storms are now facing rainfall intensity they were never designed to handle. Drainage systems overflow. Flooding appears in places that never flooded before. Not every year, not every season, just often enough to strain systems that were built for reliability, not unpredictability. Water supplies become harder to manage. Reservoirs fill too fast, then empty too quickly. Snowpack melts earlier, but demand peaks later. Communities swing between surplus and shortage without warning, and then there's heat. Not record-breaking heat every day, but heat that lingers. Heat that refuses to leave when the season says it should. Heat that stretches weeks longer, stressing power grids, crops, and human bodies at the same time. Here's what makes this dangerous. It doesn't happen everywhere at once, and it doesn't happen the same way twice. One region floods while another dries out. One year feels extreme, the next feels almost normal. Then the pattern flips again. That inconsistency creates doubt. People start saying, maybe it's just a bad year. Maybe it's random. It isn't. It's systemic. Pressure zones act like the hidden framework holding weather in place. When they shift, everything built on top of them becomes slightly misaligned. The effects show up unevenly, but they're connected. That's why this change feels confusing rather than catastrophic. There's no single moment where everything breaks, no obvious starting line, just small disruptions stacking quietly over time, mist rains, unexpected storms, lingering heat, strained systems. By the time people realize these events are related, they've already become part of daily life, and that's the real impact, not sudden collapse, but a steady loss of predictability. A world where planning becomes harder, margins become thinner, and adaptation becomes constant. All because invisible systems moved, and life is now adjusting to catch up. Here's the moment that changed the tone inside the scientific community. Until then, there was still room for comfort. Shifts could be explained as fluctuations, temporary responses to warming, patterns that might drift back given enough time. Then researchers noticed something unsettling. The pressure zones weren't just moving, they were stabilizing. Satellite timelines showed the same systems returning to the same new positions, month after month, year after year. Not wobbling, not oscillating, settling. That's when concern turned into quiet alarm, because a moving system can be tracked. A stabilizing system becomes the new normal. This wasn't a temporary fluctuation anymore. It was a remapping of Earth's balance. Pressure zones act like anchors for climate behavior. Once they lock into place, weather patterns begin reorganizing around them. Storm tracks follow the new paths. Rainfall adapts to new boundaries. Heat builds where it didn't before. And here's the part that changed everything. Reversing a stabilized system is incredibly slow. The atmosphere doesn't snap back the way people imagine. It resists sudden change. It remembers where it's been pushed. Adapting to new conditions can happen within years. Undoing them can take decades, sometimes longer. That realization forced scientists to rethink their language. This wasn't about preventing change anymore. It was about living with it, planning for it, designing around it, acknowledging that the map people relied on had shifted. The tone changed after that. Reports became more cautious, statements more precise, warnings more subdued. Not because the situation improved, but because the window for simple fixes closed. What remained was something heavier, the understanding that Earth had already begun reorganizing itself, quietly, persistently, and on a timeline faster than anyone expected. That moment reframed the entire conversation, not as a future risk, but as a present reality. People keep saying the same thing in different places, in different words. Something about the weather feels wrong. Not dangerous, not dramatic, just off. That feeling isn't imagination. Humans didn't evolve in chaos. We evolved alongside patterns. For tens of thousands of years, the body learned what to expect from the environment. When light changes, hormones respond. When seasons shift, sleep adjusts. When temperatures rise and fall predictably, the nervous system relaxes. Those rhythms shaped biology. And when those rhythms shift even slightly, the body notices, long before the mind finds language for it. Sleep patterns are often the first signal. People report restless nights during seasons that once brought rest. Mornings feel heavier. Energy dips at unexpected times. Not because of stress alone, but because circadian cues tied to temperature and daylight are misaligned. Seasonal expectations break next. Winter no longer feels like winter. Spring arrives early but behaves unpredictably. Summer stretches too long, then collapses suddenly. The body prepares for one thing and receives another. That mismatch creates subtle stress, not panic, but unease. People don't talk about pressure zones at dinner tables. They talk about how things don't feel the same anymore. That's why this story resonates quietly. No one needs a chart to feel when something fundamental shifts. The nervous system is designed to detect environmental inconsistency. It's a survival trait. When patterns become unreliable, the brain stays alert longer than it should. Rest becomes lighter. Recovery becomes harder. This doesn't show up as a single symptom. It shows up as a mood, a background tension people can't quite explain. And because the change isn't constant, it's confusing. One week feels normal, the next feels strange, then everything seems fine again. That inconsistency creates doubt. People question their own perception. They wonder if they're overreacting. They're not. What they're sensing isn't danger, it's misalignment, a planet operating on slightly different rhythms than the ones humans adapted to. That's also why conversations about the weather have changed. They last longer, they feel heavier, they repeat. People aren't just commenting, they're checking in. Because deep down there's an awareness that stability is thinning, and this is what makes the moment unique. For the first time, large numbers of people are feeling a global shift in their bodies before fully understanding it intellectually. History shows that when instinct and environment drift apart, societies struggle to explain the discomfort. Not with fear, with confusion. That's where we are now, a space where people sense change but lack a clear narrative for it. And until that gap closes, the feeling remains. You don't need a graph to feel it. You just know something isn't lining up the way it used to. This isn't about fear. Scientists are careful to say that again and again. What's happening isn't a sudden collapse. It's not an overnight disaster. And it's not a signal that everything is about to fall apart. It's about adaptation speed. For generations, infrastructure was designed using old pressure maps. Roads, drainage systems, power grids, all calibrated to patterns that behaved consistently. Agriculture followed old rainfall lines. Planting schedules assumed seasons would arrive on time. Irrigation systems expected reliability, not surprise. Cities assumed predictable cycles. Heat waves had limits. Storm seasons had boundaries. Water demand followed patterns planners could anticipate. Those assumptions weren't foolish, they were reasonable at the time. But now scientists are saying those maps no longer match reality. The planet didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait for systems to catch up. The underlying rules shifted faster than planning cycles, budgets, and politics could respond. And that's the real warning. Not everything will collapse, but the rules changed faster than we planned for. That distinction matters because systems don't fail all at once. They strain, they adapt, they absorb pressure until they can't. What scientists emphasize now is flexibility. Designing for ranges, not averages. Preparing for variability, not consistency. Updating assumptions before emergencies force them to change.